Chinese oil imports from the United States didn't just slow down in August, they nearly collapsed, and the trend isn't bouncing back anytime soon. Forecasts show that next month, America's oil exports to China will scrape the bottom of the barrel. By the middle of 2025, Beijing had quietly scrubbed U.S. crude from its shopping list altogether. The numbers tell the story from 160,000 barrels per day to virtually zero. No fiery speeches, no dramatic announcements. Just a modest 10% tariff, followed by silence. Meanwhile, as Beijing locked in massive long-term contracts with Russia and Iran, the Oval Office was still echoing with trade war slogans that felt stuck in 2018. Texas ports were running at half capacity. Pipelines that once carried energy across the country slowed to a crawl. Yet Washington spun it as leverage. The rest of the world called it what it was, stepping away from the deal table. The uncomfortable truth. The largest oil buyer on Earth had slipped away, and America was outplayed by its own supposed master negotiator. Let's rewind. China's purchases weren't astronomical, but they were steady. At around 160,000 barrels a day, they were significant enough to justify billions of dollars invested in Gulf Coast export infrastructure. Terminals were upgraded, pipelines were stretched to the shoreline, entire fleets of tankers lined up at Texas refineries waiting like rideshare drivers outside an airport. It looked like a secure, growing market. Then came February 2025. Beijing added a seemingly small 10% tariff. The impact was instant. Orders didn't slow, they stopped dead. Even American oil sold at a discount couldn't find a buyer. No official boycott, no embargo, no announcement, just silence. The kind that rings across empty port facilities from Corpus Christi to Houston. Storage tanks that once turned over weekly began sitting half-filled for months. Pipelines designed to carry oil toward Asia suddenly had nowhere to go. This wasn't an accident, it wasn't sabotage, it was deliberate strategy. China had quietly rerouted its entire future energy flow while Washington was still distracted, arguing over tariffs on lumber, ranting about renewable energy, and celebrating victories in a trade war that had already expired. But here's the twist. China didn't walk away alone. America's closest neighbors, Mexico and Canada, began sketching out something historic. The Northern Corridor. This isn't just a rail line or a road. It's a multi-billion-dollar logistics megaproject designed to bypass U.S. ports entirely. The stakes? Over $120 billion in annual trade shifted through their own Pacific and Atlantic channels. The message is clear. Keep supply chains moving, but keep them off U.S. soil. Look at the bigger picture. The U.S. used to be the anchor, the center of gravity in global trade, the reliable middleman everyone trusted. Today, even close allies are linking arms and building new lanes around the noise in Washington. The most telling part? Nobody slammed the door. They just stopped knocking. This isn't simply the loss of one buyer. It's the unraveling of a reputation. America's image as a dependable partner is eroding. And the leader in the White House? He wasn't openly rejected. He was quietly left behind, still holding the megaphone, still shouting, but addressing a room that had already emptied out months earlier. So what happened after China ghosted American oil? They didn't hesitate. They pivoted with lightning speed. Within months, Beijing locked in long-term oil supply contracts with Russia, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran. Volumes were secured, prices were locked, and not a single dollar of payment flowed through United States banks. The majority of contracts were settled in Yuan, China's own currency, deliberately cutting the greenback out of the system. This wasn't a short-term patchwork fix. It was a complete rewiring of the energy network. Trade lanes, legal contracts, tanker schedules, refinery specifications, global payment systems. Every piece of the puzzle was optimized to run on Middle Eastern and Russian blends, not on United States crude. Think of it like installing a new operating system on a computer. One that doesn't recognize the old software, doesn't read the old manual, and doesn't even need the old plugins anymore. And all the while, Washington was still clinging to a trade war playbook that had already been overtaken by reality. The world had moved on. Supply chains had redrawn themselves. Contracts had shifted. Even America's neighbors were building bypasses. But the message from the podium remained the same, loud, stubborn, and completely out of sync with the silence echoing across empty ports and idle pipelines back home. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the man who once promised he could outsmart OPEC was busy pointing fingers at Canada for rising lumber costs and ranting on social media about how wind turbines supposedly kill birds. While the rest of the world was pivoting toward new trade realities, America's energy strategy looked less like a master plan and more like a weekend garage sale, full of half-baked ideas, broken promises, and outdated slogans. Even if United States oil prices dropped to rock-bottom levels tomorrow, it wouldn't matter. The Chinese system isn't designed to take it anymore. And this is where people often miss the bigger picture. It's not just politics, it's logistics. The ports are built differently. The pipelines are routed differently. The refineries have been reconfigured. Trying to reintroduce American crude into that system today would be like trying to shove a square peg into a keyhole, blindfolded, while boasting that you invented the lock in the first place. And let's be brutally honest, the only real energy flowing out of the West Wing these days is hot air. The world's biggest oil buyer rewrote its entire playbook, and America didn't even get copied on the email. But oil was never the whole story. It rarely is. Because when China re-engineered its supply lines, it wasn't only barrels of crude that were rerouted. It was money. By July 2025, most of China's long-term contracts with Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE weren't priced in dollars anymore. They were written, signed, and settled in Yuan. Now, that detail may sound like an accounting technicality, but in reality, it was a slow, deliberate incision into the very artery of American financial dominance. Every barrel bought in Yuan is a barrel that doesn't touch the United States dollar. Every deal completed outside the American banking system chips away at Washington's ability to sanction rivals, dictate trade rules, or even keep track of how the game is being played. And here's the kicker. It's not an accident. It's the strategy. Iran, of course, found its own lane through the shadows. With its so-called ghost fleet and creative shipping paperwork, Tehran has been funneling millions of barrels into China's smaller independent refineries, the so-called Teapots. These refiners don't ask too many questions. To them, it doesn't matter whether the crude arrives labeled as legitimate or contraband. All that matters is that it's cheap, and increasingly that it's dollar-free. So what did the man in charge do while this financial shift was unfolding in real time? Not much, unless you count dismissing the Yuan as funny money during a campaign rally in Iowa. The rest of the world didn't laugh. They called it what it was, the new normal. Remember, there was a time when the United States dollar was the bloodstream of global energy. Every deal, every shipment, every tanker somehow passed through it. Today, it's just another payment option, and not the preferred one. America's much-advertised energy dominance strategy, the plan that was supposed to put the United States first, has ironically left America last at the checkout counter. And while Washington was busy losing China with overpriced oil and political tantrums, another player slid quietly into the seat America vacated. That player was Iran. Yes, the same country Washington has spent decades trying to sanction into oblivion has quietly become one of China's biggest crude suppliers. Not by asking politely, not by playing by the rules, but by perfecting the art of invisibility. Iranian oil now pours into Chinese ports through what's called the shadow fleet, a network of ghost tankers sailing under borrowed flags, carrying forged papers, and cloaked in just enough ambiguity to make United States sanctions look less like barriers and more like faded do-not-enter signs on a broken fence. And who's buying it? China's so-called teapots, the smaller private refiners scattered along its coast. They thrive on crude that's cheap, flexible, and off the books. And for them, Iranian oil is a gift. By the middle of 2025, Chinese imports of Iranian crude had exploded to over 1.7 million barrels per day, 10 times the amount China ever bought from the United States. So let's pause and recap for a moment. America tried to box Iran out. Iran found a back door. China opened it wider. And honestly, the only thing our so-called strategist in the West Wing managed to accomplish was making America irrelevant in a game it once invented. If this were Monopoly, Iran just skipped 3 turns, scooped up every property, and flipped the board, while the 47th president was still bragging about the greatest deal ever signed years earlier. Here's the brutal truth. Sanctions don't work when the rest of the table stops following your rules, especially when you keep tearing up the rulebook every time you lose a round. While Iran crept through the shadows and China redrew its energy map, America was left staring at empty docks. Export terminals in Corpus Christi and Houston, once buzzing with tankers bound for Asia, are now, well, eerily quiet, running well below capacity. Why? Because those massive facilities were built with one core customer in mind: China. And now that China has vanished from the order book, those billion-dollar ports have turned into the world's most expensive lawn ornaments. Think about the scale of the gamble here. Billions were poured into pipelines, docks, and storage tanks to ride the wave of energy dominance. But dominance means nothing if the buyer with the deepest pockets changes the channel while you're still shouting at the television. Sure, American exporters are trying to redirect cargoes to Europe, India, and South America, but let's not kid ourselves. Nobody replaces China. Not in size, not in price leverage, not in influence. This isn't some supply chain hiccup. It's a full-blown business model breakdown, built on ego, shaky math, and the kind of short-term thinking that treats tariffs like table salt. Sprinkle a little more on, and somehow the dish tastes better. The result? We're left with ports without purpose, pipelines that lead nowhere, and a White House still convinced it won a trade war that looks more like a self-inflicted wound. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, China is writing a very different story. Instead of pipelines to nowhere, Beijing has been filling barrels to the brim. By mid-2025, China had quietly expanded its strategic petroleum reserve to cover more than 3 months of imports, well above the global standard recommended by the International Energy Agency. And who filled those tanks? The usual suspects: Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia. Not exactly members of the America First fan club. But this wasn't just about preparing for emergencies. It was about power. Full reserves plus long-term supply deals priced in Yuan give Beijing a shield against price shocks, U.S. sanctions, and geopolitical pressure. With the taps secured, China can negotiate from strength, shrug off turbulence, and, most importantly, cut Washington out of the conversation entirely. And back in Washington, Congress still can't agree whether to refill America's own strategic petroleum reserve, assuming, of course, the 47th president remembers it exists at all. While Beijing's bunkers are overflowing, America's most consistent export these days isn't energy. It's denial. The West Wing is still staging its one-man show, a sequel no one asked for, Mission Accomplished 2, Trade War Boogaloo. Meanwhile, the rest of the world has quietly shifted gears. China didn't need a confrontation. It didn't need speeches or theatrics, just calculation. While Washington kept drafting press releases, Beijing was drafting bulk purchase orders. And here's the bigger reality. This isn't just a China story. The global oil map itself is being redrawn. Take India. In July, New Delhi signed expanded long-term contracts with Russia, securing millions of barrels at discounted rates. The kicker? Settlements in Yuan. To make it even smoother, they revived old Soviet-era shipping routes to move oil outside the Strait of Hormuz, avoiding choke points altogether. Look further south. Across Southeast Asia, from Malaysia to Thailand, buyers are adjusting their procurement models. They're adopting China's blueprint suppliers, who can offer flexible payment systems, especially ones free from the US dollar. Meanwhile, in Europe, American oil is still on the menu, for now. But European importers are using the wave of new supplier competition to squeeze Washington, forcing lower prices, negotiating looser insurance requirements, and demanding longer payment windows. They're playing the same game America used to dominate, but now with someone else's rulebook. This isn't a blip. This is a restructuring. Pricing formulas, shipping lanes, and even diplomatic preferences are being rewritten. And here's the hard truth. The U.S. isn't holding the pen. There was no dramatic summit, no midnight sanctions, no viral tweet saying we're done here. The world didn't shove America out. It simply rearranged the table and forgot to leave a seat. Washington didn't protest. U.S. companies didn't sound alarms. While global energy alliances rewrote contracts in the UN halls and Persian Gulf boardrooms, the White House kept recycling the same energy independence speech from 2019, like a karaoke machine stuck on repeat. The silence isn't just deafening, it's telling. In Corpus Christi, cranes that once loaded tankers now sit idle. On offshore rigs, drills that once spun 24/7 are slowing down. And on contracts that were once stamped in English, the fine print now appears in Mandarin and Arabic. No shots fired, no flags burned. Yet the outcome is the same. America has been written out of the script, not by its enemies, but by its former partners who no longer see it as necessary. That's not a defeat in battle. That's something worse. That's irrelevance. And still, the 47th president points fingers at wind farms, while the rest of the world quietly inks deals we're not even invited to witness. Because here's the truth. Power doesn't vanish in a single explosion. It fades quietly, replaced by new hands that sign the contracts, control the currency, and redraw the routes. Power doesn't always collapse with a bang. It doesn't always get ripped away in war or toppled by sanctions. Sometimes it just evaporates quietly, the moment people stop needing you. China didn't slam a door in America's face. They simply built a new house, one with new locks, new rules, and no doorway labeled U.S. entry. While Beijing was sketching blueprints for trade corridors and payment systems, Washington was tossing culture war confetti, fighting imaginary villains on cable news, mistaking noise for strategy. And the shift wasn't just in Beijing. Even Canada, our neighbor, our closest ally, the partner with whom we share the world's longest border, has started to reroute oil exports away from us. More barrels are heading toward Asia and Europe, justified by trade instability and retaliatory tariffs. That's not speculation, that's Reuters, July 2025. So let's recap the ledger. China left, Iran moved in, India adapted, Europe leveraged, Canada walked, and America? We just stood there shouting about winning while the room quietly emptied. This wasn't a hostile takeover. No one stormed the gates. It was a soft exit, a quiet one. And the most telling part? Nobody stopped to ask if we'd be okay without them, because the world already had an answer. Which leaves us with the question we've been avoiding. What happens when the rest of the world gets used to living without us? The answer won't arrive in a breaking news alert. It won't be tweeted at 2 a.m. It'll show up in silence, in trade routes that bypass us, in contracts that don't require an American signature, in summits where our name doesn't even appear on the invitation list. No fireworks, no confrontation, just a slow fade from center stage to the shadows of irrelevance. And that's the reality we're walking into. So what do you think? Are we watching the end of U.S. energy dominance or just the beginning of something even bigger? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next time someone taxes trust and dares to call it leadership.